Okay, hello everyone. Good evening. Myself Rashekar.
Hello everyone, good evening. Myself Terya Trivedi.
Good evening, ma'am. Myself is Jason. Today we are here to explain about respiratory system. So now Rakshaka Singh will start the presentation.
Hello. Today my topic is like respiratory system. Um, in respiratory system, there are three parts: anatomy of the respiratory system, mechanics of the breathing, gas exchange, and transport. First, we will look at anatomy of the respiratory system. Anatomy of the respiratory system. In this part, we have divided into three stages. First is air entry and passage through the respiratory system. Second, bronchioli, and alveoli pathway for gas exchange. And third is breathing, gas exchange, and utilization of oxygen. First, we will look at air entry and passage through the respiratory system. Air entry passes through the respiratory system. It starts from nose and at the alveoli where gas exchange happens. External nostril above opens above the upper lips, leading to the nasal chamber through the nasal passage. The nasal chamber opens into the pharynx, which serves as a common passage for both food and air. And the pharynx lead to the larynx and then to the trachea. The larynx is known for the sound box, is responsible for production of sound, and the epiglottis that covers the glottis during swallowing to prevent food from the entering larynx. Next slide. Now, bronchioli, alveoli pathway for gas exchange. The trachea, which is divided into two right and left primary bronchi at the fifth thoracic vertebra. The bronchi further divided into secondary and tertiary bronchi, leading to the bronchioles and the terminal bronchioles, and at last alveoli, where gas exchange happens. The bronchi and bronchioles are supported by the cartilaginous rings, and the terminal bronchioli end in alveoli, where oxygen and carbon dioxide, two gases, are exchanged. The lungs, which are covered by a double-layered pleura that reduce friction. The double-layered pleura, there are two types of double-layered pleura. First is parietal pleura, and second is visceral pleura. The visceral pleura is the inner layer that directly covers the lungs, and the parietal pleura, the outer layer that lines the chest wall and diaphragm. What does friction reduce friction means? Uh, Between the two layers is a small space called the pleural cavity, which contains the thin layer of a pleural fluid. This acts like a lubricant. When you breathe in and out, your lungs expand and contract, rubbing against the chest wall. Without lubrication, this movement could cause painful friction. The pleural fluid ensures that the layer pleura slide smoothly against each other, allowing for effortless breathing. It's like all reducing friction between movement parts in a machine. Breathing exchange gases and utilization of oxygen. First, the conducting part. Conducting part where include nostril to the terminal bronchial, and here it filters air. Like in a nose nasal passage, we have hairs that prevent dust from the air, and we have also mucosal fluid which also prevent from further bacterial entry, and the air inside the conducting part get humidified. Like when we when we breathe out, our air will be like moisturized and regulate air temperature too. As the air enters, the temperature, the body temperature and the air temperature become constant and same level. The exchange part, alveoli and ducts, where oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse between blood and air, where exchange of gases happens between blood and air in the alveoli part. The lungs are located in the airtight thoracic cavity, supported by the vertebral column, sternum, ribs, and diaphragm. Breathing or pulmonary ventilation moves air in and out of the lungs, whereas diffuse across the alveolar membrane. Oxygen used by the cell for metabolism and releasing carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Now we look at the diagrammatic view of the respiratory system. As starting, we have like epiglottis, and beneath that larynx, which is known for the sound box, and beneath that there is a trachea. At the fifth thoracic vertebrae, the bronchio is divided. The bronchio further is divided into primary bronchi and secondary bronchi, and the secondary and primary bronchi are further divided into terminal bronchioles, where end at alveoli. And we can see here the like yellow fluid is pleural fluid, which reduce friction, and we have cut end of ribs and diaphragm at the last. Next. Lung structure and thoracic chamber mechanism. The lung position in the thoracic chamber. The lungs are located in the thoracic chamber, which is anatomically airtight. The airtight is because of when we breathe in, expansion of happens, because that's why we have airtight thoracic chambers. The thoracic chamber is formed by the vertebral column dorsally and ventrally by sternum, and laterally by ribs, and lower side have diaphragm. Volume and pulmonary mechanism. Any change in the volume of the thoracic cavity is reflected in the lung cavity. This arrangement is critical for breathing, as the pulmonary volume cannot be directly altered. Now, Dhairya will explain further.
So, hello everyone. Now I will explain the mechanism and the further process. So, first we'll see the respiration process, the steps involved, the breathing or pulmonary ventilation by which the atmospheric air is drawn in, like the atmospheric air or oxygen comes in and the CO2 rich alveolar air is released out. So, there will be the diffusion of gases, the majorly O2 and CO2, which across the alveolar membrane. The transport of gases like O2 and CO2 by the blood, the diffusion of O2 and CO2 between blood and tissue, the use or utilization of O2 by the cells for catabolic reactions, and the resultant release of CO2. Next, the mechanism of breathing. So now I will explain the mechanism. So we have divided the following mechanism of breathing into 5 stages. The first, introduction to the mechanism of breathing. Second, the pressure gradients in the breathing. Third, the role of muscles in the breathing. Fourth, expiration and the role of muscle relaxation. And the fifth, clinical measurements and control of breathing. So first, we'll explain the introduction. The introduction. Breathing involves the two main stages. First is inspiration or inhalation. This process is of drawing the atmospheric air of oxygen into the lungs. And expiration means the process of releasing alveolar air or CO2 out of the lungs. This movement of air in and out of lung occurs by creating the pressure gradient, which happens in between the lungs and the atmosphere. The pressure gradients in breathing. The inspiration occurs when the pressure inside the lungs, which is called as intrapulmonary pressure, is less or lower than the atmospheric pressure. This will create a negative pressure in the lungs, drawing air in, like air will come inside. The expiration happens when the intrapulmonary pressure is higher than the atmospheric air, which is completely opposite from inspiration, which forces the air out of the lungs. The role of muscles in breathing. The diaphragm and the specialized muscles, the external and internal intercostal muscles, help generate the pressure gradient necessary for breathing. So, for inspiration, there will be contraction of diaphragm, which increases the thoracic volume in the antero-posterior axis. And the contraction of the external intercostal muscles lifts the ribs and sternum It will increase the thoracic volume in the dorsoventral axis. The overall increase in thoracic volume, this will lead to an increase in pulmonary volume, which reduces the intrapulmonary pressure below the atmospheric pressure, which will cause the air to move out of the lungs. Expiration. Next, inspiration. As we can see in the image, that the ribs and sternum are raising. As we breathe in, we take inspiration, the diaphragm gets contracted, and the volume of thorax will increase. Expiration. The expiration and the role of muscle relaxation. The expiration. The relaxation of the diaphragm and intercostal muscles returns the diaphragm and sternum to the normal position. This will reduce the thoracic volume. The reduce in the thoracic volume will lead to an increase in pulmonary volume, which increases the intrapulmonary pressure above atmospheric pressure, forcing out of the lungs. The expiration. As we can see in the image, that the previously the diaphragm gets contracted, here the diaphragm gets relaxed and arch upwards like an arrow. Here the volume of thorax decreased and the ribs and sternum will get back to their original position. The clinical measurements and control of breathing. The breathing strength can be increased by additional abdominal muscles during inspiration and expiration. On an average, a healthy human breathes 12 to 16 times per minute. So the volume of air involved in breathing movements can be measured using a spirometer, which is a device which helps assess pulmonary functions clinically. So now I will call my friend Dwij to explain the gas exchange and transport. So moving forward to Dwij. Thank you.
Thank you, Daya, for the explanation. Now I shall proceed with the gas exchange and transport. So we have divided the following into two stages: gas exchange and transport of gases. Yeah. So gas exchange is divided again into three stages, which is gas exchange and diffusion, partial pressure and gradients, and diffusion membrane and variable condition. So starting with the gas exchange and diffusion, primary sites are the alveoli, which are the main sites for the gas exchange. Blood tissue exchange also occurs, and the mechanism is gases like O2 and CO2 diffuse based on the pressure or concentration gradients. And the key factors involved are solubility and membrane thickness significantly affect the diffusion rate, as the rate of diffusion of gases is directly proportional to solubility and partial pressure and is inversely proportional to the thickness of diffusion membrane. So the second part is partial pressures and gradients. Partial pressure, what is partial pressure? So pressure contributed by an individual gas in a mixture of gases is called partial pressure, represented as PO2 for oxygen and PCO2 for carbon dioxide. So the data in table 1 and figure 1.1 shows concentration gradients. Oxygen is from alveoli to blood, then to tissues, and carbon dioxide is from tissues to blood, and then to alveoli. So the solubility. CO2, as you know, is the 20 to 25 times more soluble than O2, allowing higher diffusion despite similar gradient. So now this is the partial pressures in mmHg, obviously, of oxygen and carbon dioxide at different parts involved in diffusion in comparison to those in atmosphere. So respiratory gas here is O2. So the atmospheric pressure, partial pressure of O2 in atmospheric air is 159 mmHg, in alveoli it is 104, in deoxygenated blood it is 40, in oxygenated blood it is 95, and tissues is 40. In CO2 it's 0.3, and in alveoli the CO2's partial pressure is 40, and the oxygenated blood it's 40, and deoxygenated blood is 45, and the tissues is 45. So now let's see this diagrammatic representation of exchange of gases at the alveolus and the body tissues with blood and transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So as you can see, the inspired air comes in with the partial pressure of oxygen 104 mmHg and partial pressure of carbon dioxide 40 mmHg. So then it goes into the pulmonary vein, then into the systemic arteries carrying oxygenated blood, and the partial pressure of oxygen again is 95 mmHg and partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40 mmHg. Then it goes into the body tissues, then the oxygen is utilized, so the partial pressure decreases, and the carbon dioxide partial pressure increase, and the CO2 is equal to 40 mmHg and PCO2 is 45 mmHg, which is same in the systemic veins which carried the deoxygenated blood, and then it goes to the coronary artery and then to the expired tank. So this was the diagrammatic representation of exchange of gases. Now let's move on to the diffusion membrane and favorable condition. So the structure is this. The structure consists of three layers, which is thin squamous epithelium of alveoli, endothelium of alveolar capillaries, and third is basement membrane between them. So the total thickness is less than 1 millimeter, enabling efficient gas diffusion. Favorable factors are the body optimally supports. Then the oxygen diffusion is from alveoli to tissues, and carbon dioxide diffusion is from tissues to alveoli. So as you can see, the three layers I explained, the squamous epithelium at the left, and the basement substance is here in the yellow, and the endothelium of the blood capillary is also present, and red blood cells are present, and also there is a blood capillary present. So it is a diagrammatic of a section of an alveolus with a pulmonary capillary. So let's move on to the second part, transport of gases. So blood is the medium of transport for O2 and CO2. About 97% of O2 is transported by RBCs in the blood. The remaining 3% of O2 is carried in a dissolved state through the plasma. Nearly 20 to 25% of CO2 is transported by RBCs, whereas 70% of it is carried as bicarbonate. About 7% of CO2 is carried in a dissolved state through plasma. So transport of gases have again been divided into two, which is transport of oxygen and transport of carbon dioxide. So let's begin with the transport of oxygen. Transport of oxygen is the mainly by hemoglobin, which is the red ion containing pigment in RBCs, binds with O2 to form oxyhemoglobin, and it is also a reversible process. Each molecule can carry four O2 molecules. The binding factors involved are the primary are the partial pressure of oxygen, PO2, and the others are PCO2, H plus concentration, and temperature. So here you can see oxygen dissociation curve is here, and it shows that sigmoid curve how O2 binds or dissociates under different conditions. So in alveoli, there is high CO2 and low PCO2 and low H plus and lower temperature, which favors binding. And in tissue, which is low PO2, high PCO2, and high H plus and higher temperature favor dissociation. So oxygen delivery is around 5 ml of O2 per 100 ml of blood is delivered to tissues under normal conditions. And as you can see, the high PO2 is also known as the Hilden effect, and low PO2, or which was seen by the scientist Bose. So it was named as Bose effect. So as you can see, the sigmoid curve in the oxygen diffusion curve. So let's now move to transport of CO2. So CO2 is transported in the blood through multiple mechanisms, one of which is binding to hemoglobin, which again is called carbaminohemoglobin, and around 20 to 25% of CO2 binds with hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin. The extent of this binding is influenced by the partial pressures of CO2 and oxygen. In tissues, high PCO2 due to metabolic activity and low PCO2 create favorable conditions for CO2 to bind with hemoglobin. In alveoli, low PCO2 and high PO2 promote the dissociation of CO2 from carbaminohemoglobin, enabling it to release into the alveoli for exhalation. Additionally, RBCs contain the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, which catalyzes the conversion of CO2 into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions at the tissue site, where PCO2 is high. This allows CO2 to be transferred efficiently into the blood plasma. At the alveoli, where PCO2 is low, the reaction reverses, converting bicarbonate back into the CO2 and water for exhalation. On an average, every 100 ml of deoxygenated blood delivers approximately 4 ml of CO2 to the alveoli under normal conditions. This is the carbonic anhydrase reaction, which I discussed earlier, which says CO plus H2O on in the action of carbonic anhydrase enzyme gives H2CO3, which is the carbonic acid, and then it again in the presence of carbonic anhydrase gives bicarbonate ion plus H plus ion, and the reaction can be reversed again to H plus bicarbonate ion in the presence of carbonic anhydrase gives carbonic acid, and carbonic acid again breaks down into CO2 plus H2O in the presence of carbonic anhydrase. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you, ma'am. And
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
let me just switch to the yeah. Rakshi sir, can you please turn on your camera? Thank you, ma'am. So here we end our presentation of respiratory system.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone. Salamat po.